and talk to you. Just do this, get my screen up. So good evening and welcome to this part of the SLBI's series responding to and acknowledging the current international negotiations at COP26. It's fair to say, as exemplified by this now very famous representation of warming of our environment globally, that we are in a very, very important place in our world history. And the effects of the decisions over the next couple of weeks will be felt for centuries to come. So this talk I'm going to present to you is really, in many respects, some of my own personal views based upon some of the available data from pre-existing flora activities across the London area, with some dipping into some of the published science. But it is fair to say that we don't have a large amount of specific London-centric data that's analysed or is analysing how London's plant life is responding. So we have relatively little specifically published literature in this area. And I'd have to do a real hunt around to actually pull you up with a proper literature list. But there is not a lot, it's fair to say. So this talk, London's Flora, Climate Change or Changing Habits, is hopefully going to address some of the observations I and other natural historians have made in the London area over the last 30, 50, 150 years, and look at how some of these responses are potentially down to other causes, such as pollution, shifts in human activity and behaviour, as well as quite likely strongly indicative of climate change. So the responses to what is happening on the planet at the moment in the southeast England and London's plant life are very, very diverse and very, very complicated. And I just want to start off also just by quickly showing you this map with the red line for the modern Greater London as it is now, and the historic London as was in that little nubbings down here in the middle. And the reason I have these maps up is also to show how this data is actually made from a compilation of sources and information, both in literature and in databases. And much of the data I'm going to be talking about is data derived from the national database of the Botanical Society of Britain and Ireland, and also comparable data sets that are maintained on behalf of the London Natural History Society at Green Space Information for Greater London. The big circle is the LNHS recording area, often referred to as the polygon, because it's returned for recording purposes into a polygonal shape. And these are the adjoining vice counties that cross over and onto the edge of Greater London as part of the BSBI mapping scheme. Here's my county in here, so to speak. This is the county of Middlesex, which is partly in and partly out of Greater London. And so the information I'm going to be talking about is derived largely from pre-existing data sets, both in data form, but also in literature form. And in fact, literature is a often overlooked data source, which I will come back to later on. And I've put these two books up as exemplars of the tradition of county floras. Each one of the adjoining counties around London area have their own county floras, and we're lucky enough to have Rodney Burton here, who's my immediate predecessor on behalf of both the Middlesex area and also the London Natural History Society. So we are incredibly lucky that we've got in London, almost uniquely, it's really fair to say, a very, very long continuum of literature and information about the distribution of wild plants in this region. So these historical accounts are very, very important, and we're in the process of turning this information that's in printed format into a digital format that will sit more closely with what we've got on our online archives. And much of the source of my information for this, excuse me, is actually based upon Rodney Burton's Flora of the London area, which I expect some of you are familiar with. And this is a very, very important work for the London Natural History Society. We're going through the process of updating it, which is a long haul, I can assure you. But I will be referring to the maps within the Flora of the London area as we go through this talk, as well as some of the other sources. One of the things I think is fair to say is that this image in itself exemplifies the changes that have been wrought upon the Greater London area through non-climate change but anthropogenic activities. This view of the tower is no longer there because it has been swept away and replaced with City Hall and very smart, posh, tidy gardens and a lot of slate. So this species-rich habitat no longer exists. And this is a story that is told right across inner London, that many of the so-called marginal habitats that once had in the city are no longer there. So London's hundreds of years of urbanization has inevitably led to long-term decline and extinction. And these two plants I have it because one of them is one of my favorite pet plants. Marsh sow thistle is a species I'm deeply fascinated by and have been all of my life. But marsh sow thistle used to be quite widespread along the River Thames right up until the end of the 19th century. But is now virtually extinct bar one or two tiny populations in the far west on the River Crane and associated on the River Crane. So I can't remember the name of the river, off the Darrant. River Cray, naughty me. And so this is a species which has primarily been lost through the act of urbanization. It has been built upon. And this is certainly a story for much of London, as you know, in many places, plants have been lost through the act of urbanization. Other plant species, such as the bell heather, have been lost through the process of urbanization itself. So certain heathlands in the west and east south of London have been lost through development, industrial estates, etc., whereas others have been gradually eroded out of existence, partly through land management changes, most famously probably through places like Hampstead Heath, where heather species have declined and become extinct and are only maintained in one or two small areas, essentially artificially. And the other process is through pollution, through nitrification, because this is a community of plants that's intolerant of high levels of agricultural runoff, car pollutant runoff, or airplane pollution, because they are intolerant of nitrogen and the impacts this has upon the soil chemistry, and actually almost certainly the microbial and fungal diversity also suffers, as well as direct competition from plants such as nettles, which are nitrophiles, which enjoy these nutrient-rich environments. So we've seen several hundred years of gradual change through various forms of pollution and urbanization itself. And these impacts are still being felt today through in the forms of extinction. This May lily here became extinct on the Hampstead Heath, although it's debated as to this day as to whether it was truly native there, sometime at the end of the 19th or early 20th century. Other species, such as wood anemone, persist in ancient woodland landscapes, but are gradually declining. They may well hold themselves in individual patches or clonal colonies, but bit by bit, their populations are being eroded away, quite literally in many cases by footfall, but also, again, nitrification and pollutants from dog fouling, etc., etc. So many of our old surviving landscapes, such as woodland, are seeing loss of species such as this through continuing activities of humanity and pollution, and probably in some areas, additionally, the heat island effect of the urban space, the actual heat of buildings, with climate change on top, is probably pushing these cool living plants further over the edge. So we don't have some empirical data on actually these impacts in the London area. But it is fair to say, even by looking at data and observations, our surviving ancient landscapes in the London area, which are largely woodlands, we don't have a lot of ancient grassland habitats left. Our ancient woodlands are structurally there in many ways, but they've lost many of the component parts of the understory. Very few of them are now relatively species rich in such things as wood anemone, etc., etc. So we're seeing a gradual removal of this diversity, and this is an ongoing process, has been going on for 150, 200 years, of this plant diversity from habitats such as this. And it's probably a combination of effects of some of the things I just talked about. But some of it is actually quite subtle and is not really too visible and clear. And this is the first of many maps you're going to see this evening. This is the distribution of Mercurialis perennis. This is perennial wood mercury, dog's mercury rather. This is a common, and still is a common and important and widespread woodland plant, ancient hedgerow plant, and occasionally found in other habitats. And the map on the left-hand side is the map from the BSBI, the Botanical Society of Britain and Ireland. And this is the total number of records in Greater London for this species that are in the BSBI database for the last 400 years. So there are actually 4,500 records of this individual plant species in Greater London. Now, and that's up to 2021. Now, if you compare that with Rodney Burton's Flora from 1983, which was a recording activity of essentially the 1960s and 1970s, you can see that the distribution is more or less the same. There doesn't appear to be a significant difference in the distribution of this species. However, if you play with the data a little bit, things start to change. So what we have here are all of the records again, but what I've done is something a little bit crafty. The dark red are records where the species is still known for that time period, and the light areas is where the species hasn't been recorded more recently. So the red and the orange are the total records, and then the paler colour is where it is no longer being found. So if you look post 1970 here on the left, you can see there appears to have been some losses in the edges of the urban areas as London starts to expand. Now, if we roll forward to post 2000, particularly in the north of Greater London, you can see the disappearance of this plant is actually much, much more profound. It does appear to be giving way in the face of continued urbanization. This is a species which is a persistent perennial. It can withstand long periods of suboptimal habitat, but sooner or later it does appear that it begins to fade away, probably through some of the processes I just talked about. So even apparently widespread plant species appear to be dying out in some areas of London. Other species which we know are nationally in trouble, we can see this effect very, very clearly in the Greater London area. Campanula rotundifolia is listed at risk of extinction across England, which is a pretty damning state of affairs for us as a nation. And this is a species which, like heather, is intolerant of heavily nutrient environments and is incapable of competing with other species. It needs short grassland sward and low nutrients to thrive. And once more, you can see this particular map from the BSBI. This is the total records for the whole of the Greater London and LNHS area, or just over 1,000 of them over the last 400 years or so. But the picture is pretty bad when you start breaking it up into time frames. So post 2000, the number of sites has dropped considerably. And it's fair to say that some of these dots, these squares, which are overly representative of how many plants there are in that particular area, it's probably in a worse situation than this appears on here. This is a species which is declining severely, particularly in the northern half of London. And just to show you the granularity of the data that we can get from the Botanical Society in terms of mapping, for those of you who are not familiar with it, if you look further down, this is from a section of the map above, drilled into in the southwest, you can see almost individual clonal patches are marked out on these hills in the south. So we have a very, very fine granular understanding of where these increasingly rare plants are and how they are responding ultimately to climate change under the negative impacts. In many cases, these populations are probably going to fade away through dog fouling, poor habitat landscape management, but it is probable also if they survive long enough that climate change is going to make it too hot for this species as well. So we're seeing a pattern of pre-existing plants of the London area struggling, these long-established natives and non-native plants. There have been of late some winners, and they are particularly species which are highly mobile. So annuals or plants such as orchids with very fine seed, which is wind dispersed. And I suspect some of you may have heard the news of a orchid species being found on a green roof in central London last year. First record in first record at all for the Greater London area. This lizard orchid here on the left is another London first. This was found on a roadside verge in West London back in, I think, 2006. Now, what makes lizard orchid very interesting is it's fabulous. It's one of our rarer orchid species. It used to be extremely rare, but southern England is on the edge of its global range, and the lizard orchid abundance and distribution has oscillated quite wildly through the 20th century through minor changes in climate. So there's been a series of studies done in the 1940s and 50s and 60s on how the range of this species has moved north to a few plants getting up as far as places like Northamptonshire and further than that, and then retrenching in colder periods in the 20th century, right down in Sandwich in Kent, which has been one of the relatively few areas where it held out. It is now going through quite a significant expansion with well-established colonies. They're still rare across quite a wide range of areas of southern England. And this particular plant was the very first one recorded in Greater London in 300 years of recording. So these rare and unusual events can give you a sort of indicator of, special things happening. But in many cases, we really need to be looking at bulk data to get understanding. Incidentally, this incredibly rare and protected orchid is treated appallingly by the people responsible for it. This was it in its location before they treated it really badly. It's currently surrounded by wood chip and membrane in essentially a tiny plant prison, which is absolutely disgraceful, frankly. So I still want to largely talk about the last 150 years or so, but I really did want to talk about this important event, the Great Fire of London. I'm sure many of you have heard this particular story from me before, so I'm only going to mention it briefly. But one of the more extraordinary impacts of the Great Fire was in the burn sites afterwards. This particular plant, London rocket, appeared in huge abundance. It then thrived for a couple of decades and then became increasingly rare to essentially more or less extinct in the London area. This is a species which is showing quite a strong rebound in London over the last 30 to 40 years, certainly the last 20 years, and has become locally frequent in some of its old haunts around the Tower of London and the canals in East London, but also in new locations elsewhere. Now, what is interesting about this species, and I'll come back to this idea, is that this is essentially what we refer to as a wintergreen annual. This is a Mediterranean type environment plant, and it needs a certain degree of warmth to grow through the winter and then flower successfully in spring. So this is a species which, not surprisingly, in the colder parts of the Victorian era in the early 20th century, did not do well in southern England, but it is actually moving quite rapidly now. And the other great event in London's history, along with the multitude of urbanization processes, is obviously the two great wars, and the Second War in particular, and the very, very important impacts that the Blitz had upon our city. This created new habitats and niches for many, many plants. and they became very fascinating to many people. And, you know, the London Natural History Society set up a specific project in the 40s and 50s, looking at the flora of London's bond sites. Now, one of the things about this is that many plant species that were very positively affected by this expansion in what we later called brownfield sites appear also to be seeing some very complicated things happen in their distribution. So I'm just going to talk about one or two of them, one of which is Hirschfeldia incana. Now, Hirschfeldia incana is a European member of the cabbage family. It's this yellow plant just down here. And Hirschfeldia has been grown, been an escape in Britain and Ireland for quite a few decades. And again, if you look at Rodney Burton's Flora, you can see that even right up into the mid-70s, this was still a scarce plant, holding out essentially in these urban brownfield sites and associated lands such as railway lands and such like. It requires open landscape and habitat. It's not a great competitor. Now, if you look again at the current distribution of this species, this is a species which has gone through an explosive range expansion in Britain over the in the London area, but also Britain as a whole, over the last 30, 40 years or so, with nearly 4,000 records across a very wide range of most of the urbanized parts of the LNHS area. So this is a species which appears to have expanded very, very significantly. Curiously, and I forgot to actually put this slide in, naughty me, Oxford ragwort, Senecio squalidus, which is another one of these classic plants of these habitats, appears to be going out through a similar scalloping out as I described with Mercurialis, with dog's mercury. It still has a widespread distribution across the London area, but it appears, looking at the data and just through observations, to becoming rarer in the increasingly tidy and smart streets and suburbs of inner London in particular. Now, Buglio davidii is, you know, one of the most abundant and familiar and recognizable urban plants and increasingly rural plants, unfortunately. This is a species which is so frequent, many people think of Buglio as almost as being a British native. In fact, actually, its first wild record in the London area was in the 1920s. So from 1920 to now, essentially 100 years, this species has become one of the most abundant species in the Greater London area. 14,000 records. You could make millions of records of it with its great abundance. But again, even so, you can see compared with the current records here from 2020, apologies, getting my decades wrong, there's been quite a marked expansion from the period of Burton's Flora that was published in 1983, but is based upon 60s and 70s data primarily. This is a plant which is proceeding to expand into the wider landscape. But you can play with the data a little bit more, because you can also look, if you change the settings in the BSBI data, you can look at the density of the records, which in some parts is a partial reflection of recorder effort, as we call it, but probably is also an indicator of abundance of this plant in a particular area. And you can see even now it is still overwhelmingly an abundant species of the core urban areas, despite its widespread distribution across the Greater London area. Now, if it's pity John Edgington's not here, because he could do this bit for me. So Maidenhair spleenwort is a representative of the genus Splenium, which historically in London has done very badly in the 19th and most of the 20th century, primarily almost certainly due to air pollution. This is a species like lichens, or a genus rather, that is intolerant of high levels of atmospheric pollution. So despite the abundance of old walls, limestone walls, Georgian buildings, etc., and Victorian railway arches, this is a species which declined very, very severely in much of the 20th century, but then has gone through a resurgence as we have cleaned our air, well, from certain things, not carbon dioxide, but we've removed nitrates, particulates to a certain extent, and sulfur. This is a species which is returning once more. So again, comparing the two sets of maps, you can see this is Burton's map from the the latter sort of 2/3 of the 20th century, 60s and 70s. You can see there's still quite a large void in the distribution of this species in what is inner London now. And then if you look at the current records, this is a species which has moved back into inner London with a great deal of success and has colonized many old landscape walls, etc., that were previously unavailable to it because of pollution. So clean air activity does impact our native biodiversity. And it also, alongside shifts in the climate, is helping native species from other parts of the British Isles and Britain and Ireland rather colonize the London area. We've had at least a couple of known incidents of sea spleenwort. Now, this is a plant which is really quite tender. It really does not like frost. It does not like the cold. This is a native of the South Coast, Cornwall, Isles of Scilly, Southwest Island, and a few places up the west coast of Great Britain. Even in the far southwest, you rarely find it more than 20 meters from the sea. It is that intolerant of frost. And similarly, lanceolate spleenwort has a similar distribution, slightly more focused in on the southeast west. Both of these are frost intolerant species that are closely associated with coastal areas. Both of these species have been recorded in the Greater London area in the last 10 years, which is extraordinary because these have not been transplanted. These are not garden plants which people have grown in a garden and then they've skipped over the garden wall. This is long distance migration blowing through the air as spores from their closest wild populations, which in many cases are 100, 150 or so miles away today. So this is a long distance dispersal into an area which is impacted by the urban heat island effect, but also increasingly the warmth from the city from climate change. So these are species which are likely to do, particularly the lanceolate spleenwort, because it is also, it is more tolerant of not having salt around. In fact, actually salt's rather toxic, whereas a sea spleenwort likes a bit of salt in its diet, so to speak. So these species have definitely benefited, although they are still vanishingly rare in the Greater London area. Oops, oh, just overshot, apologies. So I'm going to return to looking at data, but I wanted to talk about this particular species. So this is spotted medic. Unfortunately, I didn't appear to have a picture in my file. So this is a member of the pea family with small yellow pea flowers. Now, this is currently a very, very abundant species. Now, spotted medic is generally considered to be a native or long-established wild plant in southern Britain. Now, these records here are from pre-1900. Now, for various reasons, looking at the information, this is an under-recording of its known distribution in the London area for 1900. I'll explain why a little bit later on. You can see here that these large squares are because in the past, one of the standard recording formats in terms of area of extent was 10 kilometer squares from the OS grid reference. We now tend to record at a finer resolution, such as a 1 or 2 kilometer square or even finer. So quite often some of the older records are resolved at a 10 kilometer square. It's fair to say it's not found all across that 10 kilometer square area. So spotted medic was a little bit more abundant than this here, but it was largely found along parts of the Thames corridor and virtually nowhere else. Again, as you move through a time series, you can see this similar lack of resolution, but it's more widespread. This is 1900 to 1950. Again, largely concentrating on the Thames corridor. This is a primarily, or was primarily, a coastal warmth-loving species. The genus Medicago is essentially a Mediterranean genus. They like warmth, they like mild winters, and many of them are annuals. So this is a Mediterranean plant at the northern edge of its global range. And then 1951 to 1980, similar, you can see a similar distribution, but a bit more granular in the detail. Then we move forward, 81 to 2000, there's a gradual increase in abundance and a movement away from the Thames corridor, as we refer to it. And each one of these little patches of distribution tells us something as well. This patchy distribution is in many ways reflects a human-derived distribution. These new populations have been moved around through ballast, road workings, people moving diggers around, possibly the seeds, which have got little spiny protuberances on the seed cases, catching on the hair of dogs or people. So this is a very much a human and non-natural distribution pattern that you're seeing here. And again, most emphatically from 2000 onward, this species has surged in abundance and in its distribution, and it continues to be found in areas where it's not been seen before and is increasingly very, very frequent. And this is classically an example of a plant which, when I first started botanizing in London 30 odd years ago, I didn't see very often, and now many of us botanists barely give it a glance. This is another example of this process, and I strongly believe, we don't have the empirical data to prove it, we need the resources to do a proper analysis of this, but it fits with what we're understanding about climate, that these species are responding to climate, is another example of this. We have two species of poa here. This is Poa annua, the very widespread annual meadowgrass, and then this sickly yellow creature is the early meadowgrass. I've mentioned this example many times in the past to people, but I'm going to do it again because it's actually really important and frankly very interesting as far as I'm concerned. So up until 1980s, early meadowgrass was considered a rare plant of the far, far southwest of Britain, of West Cornwall, the Lizard and the Isles of Scilly. Through that time period and into the early 90s, it gradually started expanding along the south coast. And then around 2004, it was found in London for the first time by myself and by David Bevan, literally within a day or two of each other in Haringey in 2004, I think it was. So, and I actually think we've now got a couple of earlier records that have come to light. So I think it's actually turned up probably in around 1999 in the London area. So similarly, again, looking at the botany records for the London area, you can see this rare sparse distribution. The best hypothesis for this spread is, again, is not natural. It has moved into the London area through the activities of humanity, possibly seeds being picked up on clothing, car wheel arches, etc., maybe even machinery such as mowers, and also very, very likely through the introduction of garden plants from southern Europe. So these large container-grown plants have soil and seed and plant communities in them, and when you plant them in your garden, you're introducing a little bit of the Mediterranean basin into your garden, and you'll often be introducing things you don't know about, such as this Poa and other species. So once more, there's been this shift in distribution and abundance. So if I run through the time series, this is 2000 to 2010, gradually becoming more common, primarily, again, in the core heat island area of the city and the coastal areas less impacted by frost. And the reason for this is because this is a species, like many other Mediterranean annuals, that germinates after the autumn rains, grows gradually through the cooler period of the winter, and as the sunlight increases and the warmth increases in early spring, late winter, it grows very fast and starts to flower as soon as the sunlight levels are inappropriate. And often, certainly in parts of London, it will then die off and be virtually invisible by the end of April or May, depending on the climatic conditions. So this is a species that needs warmth. This is not a species that would have been able to establish in the London area 100 years or so ago, our winters would have been far too cold for it to have thrived. And again, you can see up to 2015, this gradualistic expansion is occurring, and now it is spreading out into other suburban areas. And this is a pattern which is being found all over southern England in this species. Other species from the Mediterranean basin or with a similar ecology that are having this response are such things as the wonderful Mediterranean nettle Urtica membranacea, which again was first recorded in Britain in 2004 and is now locally frequent in a few parts of inner London. Common cudweed, which has been with us for hundreds, if not thousands of years, is a species which used to be associated with nutrient-poor arable grassland habitats, acid grasslands, and nationally was becoming rarer and rarer and rarer as agricultural improvements occurred. It was virtually extinct in the London area 30 years ago, and this is a species which is still very uncommon, but is reappearing fairly frequently in various parts of the capital. Similarly, the genus Fumaria, another wintergreen animal genus, is becoming occasionally established in parts of southern England and London area. Excuse me, have a quick sip of water, check the time, need to speed up, naughty me. So ivy broomrape is an interesting one because this is a species which has been with us for centuries. It's generally considered native and was very, very rare in the London area. It is still a scarce species, and its distribution is almost very strongly associated with the planting and movement of ivy as bedding or as landscaping plant around. This is a parasitic species which feeds off ivy and nothing else. So 30, 40 years ago, there were virtually no spots of this in the Greater London area. It is now becoming gradually more frequent, partly because this again is a Mediterranean climate species, but probably also human activity spreading it around. And many of our garden plants, which we once thought of as being strictly garden plants that would not jump the fence, over the last 10 or so years in particular, are now regularly regenerating and being found as garden escapes. And this is particularly important because, for example, passion flower has been grown in British gardens for nearly 300 years, if not slightly more. Cordyline australis has been grown in lowland Britain and British gardens for 150 or so years. It is only in the last 20 years or so, or even less in the Greater London area, that these species, the climate has been sufficiently warm that they have been able to regenerate and produce seedlings and move out of the garden environment. It is now fairly common to find cordyline seedlings in urban and suburban areas in southern Britain. They're often overlooked because they're grassy and they usually don't last because of weed killers, but they are there. Tree of Heaven is the ultimate exemplar of this delayed response. This is a tree species which has been grown in British gardens since 1760 or thereabouts. For most of that time period, this was a benign street tree, garden ornamental, which very, very rarely produced seedlings. It has gone from being a rare producer of seedlings, as indicated by the Rodney Burton's map. This map here is picking up essentially seedlings found in the warm core urban area, to being widespread across much of the warmer parts of Greater London. This species still seems to be constrained by the heat island effect, but we are starting to find it out further afield in the suburbs. So this is a species which, with climate change, is going to become more abundant. We only need to look slightly further south in parts of France to see what is awaiting us, because this is one of the most severe invasive species across southern and central Europe. So this is a species which is here to stay, unfortunately. Another impact which is often overlooked, and again, it's not really very well studied and documented, is how the impacts of the North Seas rising, southern England sinking, and the pushing of increasingly saline water into the River Thames is affecting our plant life. So this is Trepcock Ness, one of the relatively few pieces of semi-natural graded vegetation within Greater London, which is increasingly at threat from development, unfortunately, and from being made smart and nice for people, which is a tragedy. Now, one of the things that is quite well documented is we know through the work of a chap from Natural History Museum, whose name just slips my memory, naughty me, has done a lot of work looking at the historic botanical records of algae species in the lower River Thames and in the Thames estuary. And he's documented very clearly that over the last 100 years or so, seaweed species which used to only get as far as, say, somewhere like Gravesend or Sheerness are moving further west as the North Sea rises and pushes into the River Thames, and the River Thames becomes saltier. Similar processes are being seen in salt-tolerant or salt-loving plants, such as Aster tripolium, as was now this is Tripolium pannonicum, and this little hare's ear, which is a member of the Cabbage. These are both salt marsh species. This isn't showing the data very, very clearly. We're seeing here actually there is quite considerable, and this is probably under-recorded, we need to do more recording, increase in the abundance of sea aster within the inner part of Greater London. And it definitely seems to be pushing westwards and upwards through that form of pollution. Now, many of our native and long-established wild plants are dwindling, but some are holding out. And in terms of grassland herbaceous plants, the species that tend to hold out are those that have a capacity to create rhizomatous running mats, such as Stachys palustris here. This often survives in little cracks, etc., in urban areas, on canal sides and such. Species such as Clinopodium and this Teucrium scorodonia are really, really struggling because they tend to be more clump forming, and they are not able to move around the landscape as well in many respects as these other species. And in particular, they're very, very vulnerable to the forms of pollution I've mentioned, particularly nitrogen pollution. So we're seeing quite a few of these native species becoming incredibly rare, actually, in much of Greater London. Similarly, compared to, oh, I just wanted this up here, naughty me, apologies, I'm not going to talk about these two. I want to talk about Eupatorium cannabinum, apologies. And I wanted to show you one of the problems we have with just relying on a single form of data source. So these maps here are about hemp agrimony, one of my favorite plants, and hemp agrimony's historic distribution, when you look at the data in the database, gives us this distribution, 3 dots. So by that inference, you would believe it to be a very, very rare plant in the Greater London back in the 19th century. Now, that is not quite the case, because essentially not all of the data from the 19th century was in point format. It wasn't in locational data. It was essentially qualitative in many cases. So sometimes for longer time series, it's very easy to make assumptions which are incorrect about the former distribution of some of our species. Currently, the distribution is this. It is a fairly widespread but patchily distributed species across the London area, mainly associated with the River Thames and wet woodlands in various suitable damp habitats, but is increasingly being found in parts of inner London, possibly on occasion through introduction as a plant that is suitable for invertebrates. Now, coming back to this early data, I wanted to point out the value of being able to look at the literature, look at what people wrote in the time. And this is something that is often overlooked. And these are various statements from some of the floras from the region in the mid-19th century, or the latter third of the 19th century, and also Burton's flora in 1983. So if we start with Essex, it actually, if you read this statement, he says Halstead common, Hatfield abundant, Stratford rare. Actually, those are the only locations where he's specific about the status of the species. Nevertheless, Gibson doesn't give many records and locations for this species across the southern part of Flora of Essex. So it is probably was an uncommon species across much of Essex, with occasionally finding places such as Hatfield where it is abundant. However, in Surrey, it's observed to be frequent throughout the county, whereas Tryman and Dyer for Middlesex, rather rare. And then continuing on, you have Hanbury and Marshall saying common in all districts for the Flora of Kent, and Burton at the end saying a fairly common plant in Scotland. So this is a species where if you just looked at the distributional data that's published in that, you would get a probably rather erroneous assumption that this was becoming much, much more common than it was 100, 150 years ago. So this is a species which is probably, looking at the data as we have it then, more or less holding its own in parts of the London area. Got one or two last examples to talk about on the mapping front, and again to just put the London context into the national framework of really what's happening. So two species which are now very, very common in the London area and are also in parts of the country very, very common as well. So round-leaved cranesbill, Geranium rotundifolium, its early distribution was quite random and patchy, and it's often described again, I believe, as being native, but this distribution to me seems to be slightly curious and possibly non-native. It doesn't seem to have a biogeography as such, although the southwestern populations might well be. So this is a species which was, before 1950, had quite a scattered, patchy distribution, often associated with certain forms of urbanization or damper habitats such as the Somerset Levels, parts of the Severn system here, and areas associated with the Thames. Again, roll the clock forward to post 2000, the current day, and you can see this is a species which has massively expanded its range, and it's also fair to say has become much, much more abundant even within the territory it once had previously occupied. Again, this is a species which 30 years ago was considered to be pretty uncommon to rare. It's north of the River Thames in Greater London and locally frequent south of the Thames. It is now becoming quite a common plant north of the river. And these distributions, you know, the best fit for this is a mixture of climate change, making this essentially a Mediterranean species, fit into this environment better, probably with some added distribution through human activities. And then what is often described as the most sort of stark distribution change is often referred to as the species which has spread the most rapidly over the last 20 or 30 years across Britain and Ireland, is water-bent Polypogon viridi. Again, a species which 30 years ago I get quite excited about seeing in London. Now you just smile sweetly at it as it grows there. And you can see how sparse this was across both the UK and Ireland up until the 1950s. Again, essentially these random dots associated with urbanisation and the warm southwest. Give it 100 years of population establishing and warming climate, this species has become very, very widespread in urban areas and is being increasingly found outside of urban parts of England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland. So we're seeing quite a rapid shift in plant distributions, and the most parsimonious fit for this is frankly a mixture of climate change and human transport and movement, as well as other negative impacts such as nitrogen pollution on some of our species which are declining. So what does the future hold for London's flora? Now, one of the things it's fair to say is species of trees and shrubs which are going to do well, if you look at the herbaceous plants that I've talked about, strongly predictive, anything that likes a Mediterranean climate is going to do well here. So many of the trees and shrubs which are native or well established in the Mediterranean basin are likely to become increasingly important components of our vegetation in the southeast England and the London area, frankly, whether we like it or not. So certainly on the south coast, Mediterranean habitat plants such as holly, because holly is essentially a Mediterranean species, laurel, cherry laurel, other evergreen shrubs of that nature are becoming quite well established. Viburnum tinus. These are the species which are going to form quite significant parts of our woodland, as well as such species as olive. I've not seen olive naturally regenerating in southeast England or the London area as yet, but I suspect before I die, I will see that happen. Our climate is not very far removed from that possibility. So it is quite likely in the future that our climate is going to have to embrace a circum-Mediterranean tree and shrub flora, because some of the trees and shrubs we have in southeast England will not survive even under relatively mild climate projections. We tend to think of beech as being a warm loving tree because it's largely originally a southeast England species in Britain and Ireland, but this is a species which is intolerant of heat and drought. So the future for plants such as beech and birch in southeast England is pretty poor, and we need to be looking potentially at a suite of plants in our landscape which fit the ecosystem and the environmental conditions that are going to be around us in the future. I suspect whether we like it or not, we are going to have to embrace European oak species such as Quercus pubescens and other oak species from further south in Europe, because I suspect our native populations will not withstand the change. But it is fair to say there are a huge amount of unknowns. We still have got virtually no empirical studies on population structure, likely genetic resistance, not only of tree species in southern England, but grasses, herbaceous plants, shrubs, etc., etc. We are essentially crossing our fingers and hoping for the best. And that is a really dreadful way of proceeding into the future. So on that slightly dire note, I'll just finish off by saying that, essentially this talk would not be possible without our wonderful amateur natural historian community that we have both in this city, but also further afield. And thank you to all the lovely folk in this picture and further afield, both in the London Natural History Society and the Botanical Society of Britain and Ireland, and in particular to Rodney Burton, my predecessor. Thank you. And any questions?
Okay. Now, are you going to